Hi and welcome back. This is the last in our little series about improving winter camping with our Eriba feeling with the pop-top roof bed upstairs. Having owned one of these for a few years now, we're super familiar with why it's totally brilliant in some respects, but also why the things that make it brilliant are also a bit of a pain. And of course, when it comes to choosing a caravan or a motorhome or a camper van, there's always a compromise. And so for us, the things that make this particular caravan absolutely brilliant still far outweigh the things that are a pain. We bought this caravan in February 2017, so we've been through the end of one winter, 2 full winters, and we're just heading into our 3rd winter now. And interestingly, in mainland Europe, where these things are much more common, for example in Germany and the Netherlands and so on, it's also much more common to find indoor or covered storage. So you've got both a drier atmosphere and covered storage. So the thing that's a total pain about this sleeping roof is actually because it's exposed to the extremes of heat and cold and the dampness that's inherent in the UK climate. So as you know, and until we're hit with massive climate change, the UK could probably be described as at the battleground of cold Arctic air coming down and tropical warm wet air coming up. And it's this positioning that gives us our very variable and sometimes interesting climate. But it also makes us much warmer and wetter than we would otherwise be were it not for the North Atlantic, now let me get this right, the North Atlantic deep water circulation current. So anyway, back to the topic at hand. This damp climate has proven our key problem with looking after the sleeping roof in this caravan. A very thick mattress and the platform that's between the downstairs space here, the bit that's incredibly well insulated in the standard Hymer way, and the upstairs space. Effectively it's 2 different air spaces. So down here we're really well insulated and really well ventilated as well. Let me show you what those things look like. So first off, let's work out how to rotate this camera. Can we do it live? No, we can't. Right, back in a second. So here in the front locker, just behind the levelling ramps, the extra hook up for the awning. So we've got one of these great big ventilation ports going right through the floor. That's in the front locker next to all the electrics. There's another one of these matching vents at the back of the caravan under the rear fixed bed, but that's even more full of stuff, chairs and so on. And that's next to the cold water storage tank. There's also a permanent vent in the roof above the rear bed here. So by leaving the seats and the bed slightly open and the windows on their ventilation catches, you can get a huge amount of air flowing. But there's no vent at the rear of the roof bed, and there really should be a second skylight back here, in my opinion. That would solve an awful lot of issues. And so this leads to 2 different air spaces with nothing whatsoever causing the air to move in the rear part of this upstairs space. Dead, stale air spaces are usually a major problem when it comes to the formation of moulds and mildew and so on. We almost have to treat the caravan as 2 separate areas. So the downstairs here can be easily ventilated. We've got the ventilation under there, and of course there's a gap underneath for the air to flow through, and of course it's easy to leave the seats up. And then up at the top here you can see that the top area is effectively sealed off. So if the mattresses come out, then that gives what, 3 centimeters, 4 centimeters air gap to go through along most of the length. But then in behind there, it's almost like a separate area. In a super insulated space, this might not be so much of an issue, but I believe, although I haven't cut a hole in the roof to be categorical about this, that the roof is relatively poorly insulated. I believe it from simply looking at the thickness that this roof is, and so that I believe it's just the fairly thick fiberglass shell with maybe a few millimeters of foam, maybe not, and then this velour polyester fabric lining on the inside. Normal flat Eriba pop tops, the silvery touring series that you're used to seeing, I'm told are built conventionally with proper foam insulation in their roofs, so it's just these which are different. Ours was manufactured by SCA, who I understand from VW fanatics have a reputation for high quality and solidity, but perhaps a little bulky. From our experience, I'd say I concur completely. So anyway, it's this combination of dead airspace and relatively badly insulated roof that's the crux of the matter. When it gets cold outside, the surface of the upstairs ceiling gets cold as well, and at some point, my gut feeling is to say somewhere around 4 or 5 degrees is the tipping point, the air in the caravan can no longer hold the water vapour, which is always held in the air in varying amounts depending on the temperature, and then it condenses out. And where does it condense out? Well, of course, onto the coldest surface. And so that's the underside of this roof. Hymer's guidance to owners is to open the roof bed to air as much as possible, and at least every few weeks. Well, as you know, some years that can be a pretty tall order in the UK. Shame that on the continent where it's covered storage is much more available, it's also much drier. So anyway, that's what we did the first complete year, with removing the mattresses as per the instructions, and I have to say it was a bit of a disaster. We've been out in the van for a weekend towards the end of November, and it rained solidly for 3 or 4 weeks after, felt like forever, so I hadn't had a chance to air it as soon as we got back. In retrospect, I should have popped the roof open anyway, and the heating on, because although the canvas would have been wet on the outside, at least the inside would have had a chance to fully air. So just before Christmas, when we finally had a dry day, I popped the roof open and got a very nasty surprise. We had black mildew spots forming. Interestingly, the concentration was much higher in the bit of the roof that was pointing directly north, which concurs with this idea of the temperature, so the coldness of the roof causing formation. So the caravan's positioned in such a way that it does catch a bit of morning sun, and that carries on through quite a bit of the day, although it's noticeably colder in the northern segment. And since then, from what I've seen, this seems to be a common problem. This, for example, is the roof in a HymerCar Yellowstone camper van that I popped into a dealership to have a look at the following Easter. It's not looking as bad as ours, although it does look better in this photo than it did in real life. But the dealer said this roof was only closed each night and when the office was closed. I don't think actually they'd noticed what was going on up here, to be frank. Whilst I was at the dealership, I noticed then that there were water drops on the underside, but the outside part of the lid. So I checked ours a couple of weeks later, when the caravan hadn't been used for a while, and noticed that indeed we also had water droplets. Now, these roofs aren't designed to seal onto the roof below. The black rubber trim around the edge is just there to stop the sharp fiberglass edges from rubbing through the aluminium roof on the main part of the caravan. Plus, it's slightly shaped so that there's a bit of a gap at the back so that any rain or perhaps spray from when you're driving, if any of that does get in there, then it can get out easily. The solid bit of the upstairs sidewall stands about 10 centimetres proud, so there's no chance of water getting into the main caravan through that route. But look at what I found on the underside. There are indeed water droplets. It's rained a couple of times over the last couple of weeks, but regardless, rain doesn't fall upwards, and the lid was closed, so these water droplets on the underside of the roof can only be from water condensing on this surface. Now, because this fiberglass shell is a single piece, and there's no thermal break between the bit that's outside and the bit that's inside the canvas, the only extra thing the inside has, I think, is the velour sealing fabric. So I was more convinced than ever that in this damp UK climate, this roof is indeed just a condensation magnet below certain temperatures. Anyway, let me talk you through what we learnt about managing it, and therefore making the most of this otherwise brilliant feature. So a few uncomfortable hours laid on cardboard directly onto the bed slats, upside down, covered in safety glasses and in very old clothes, scrubbing with some specialist fabric mildew remover. And after that, we were finally clear again. Wasn't a fun or a comfortable job, and I never want to have to do it again. Hence sharing our tips today to try and help somebody else from having to go through that. So once the ceiling was dry again, I went to town with those trays, the plastic tubs of dehumidifier crystals on the bed slats, and a big 360-degree container hung from the roof handles themselves. As I said, the rest of the van is incredibly well insulated, so it can be treated like a normal caravan. Just ensure it's well ventilated. These days you don't need to do anything else really. If you use a dehumidifier, you're really just sucking damp air in from the outside, unless you've blocked all the vents, of course. So I almost want to treat the two areas as two separate caravans. A conventional one, where I can just ensure good airflow by ensuring the vents aren't blocked, all the cushions are stood up on end, and the cupboard doors are open, and so on. And then a totally separate space upstairs, which really needs to be hermetically sealed, heated slightly, and full of dehumidifying crystals, or a machine which somehow vents the air up here and vents it out somewhere else. I'm sure I could have put some sort of thick plastic sheeting across the access space here to achieve that, but this time I opted for the simplest solution, which was a couple of freestanding dehumidifier crystal trays in the back and this Aero 360 thing at the front. I suppose another solution would have been to leave the roof up all winter long, but that would have presented its own problems and would have just led to weathering on the canvas. Interestingly, even with these in the roof, it still felt damp to the touch here when I went into air, but thankfully no more mildew spots. I suspect, although I can't prove it, after all, I'll need to buy a humidity data logger so that the damp on the ceiling can be monitored when I'm not perturbing the result. The reason I suspect that it's something to do with me coming into the caravan is because when I lift the lid, this happens. Immediately the lid comes up, it seems clear, but when I turn around a few seconds later, this has happened, suggesting that because the metal is very cold, but before I was there the air was at least dry. But it's a human in the caravan that's creating the humidity. Anyway, that's a lot of relatively detailed scientific pondering. What do you think? Have you had this issue in a pop-top? Please share your thoughts, pop a comment below. So then last winter we took the same approach, but by then we'd fitted the upstairs heating extension, so I closed all the downstairs outlets, the heater outlets, completely, and set the heating to its lowest setting, and let it run on the coldest days in late December, January, and just a few days in February. The ceiling in this open area still felt a bit damp sometimes, and although we had absolutely no mould or black spots, these orange bleeds did appear in the fabric. I can only conclude, because they also smell of iron. I worked in a lab for a few years and you get to using lots of your senses to identify stuff. Anyway, it must be rust coming from all the fixings in the roof. Our roof clamps also went a bit whitish and discoloured, and the paint started flaking off here on these black lower parts of the clamp, again caused by slight rusting underneath, although they were supposed to be powder coated. The galvanised parts were all replaced under warranty at the year 2 service, and the team at the dealership did their very best to sort these black clamps out and also to get the rust marks out of the ceiling fabric. Of course, rust being rust, they didn't manage to completely remove them. So what about this coming winter? Well, what I'd really like to do is cut a hole in the roof and mount a second mini Hecky skylight at the back here, or failing that, just drill a large hole and fit a solar powered vent, just like the ones that the James Baroud company use to keep mould and mildew out of their roof tents. So those are hardshell roof tents, and you can leave the tent on your vehicle all year round because of this ventilation. But this caravan has a 6-year water ingress warranty. It's finished its 2-year everything covered warranty, but I don't want to invalidate the water ingress one. Realistically, I don't think we'll ever need it, but it just feels wrong to invalidate something that comes as part of the package. So in the short term, I bought a small powered dehumidifier, and I bought this one because I want to help add a fan to the system to help move the air around much more up here. In the longer term, I'm going to develop a plan to get some more heating ducting and create a giant U-shaped heating extension up here, so that I can run the fan in the heating system and a very small amount of heat on the very coldest days. That will help keep the heating much more consistent for the boys up here when they're asleep as well. So the other thing I wanted to mention was about thermal bridging. This is where an overall well-insulated structure has something within it which conducts heat all the way through the structure, creating a bridge from the warm side to the cold side. On our way to Scotland once, in a perishingly cold April, I think the beast from the east had just visited, as there was still snow on the ground, the boys and I made a late night stop up in somewhere around the Lake District. We were off-grid, so the heating was running on gas and the lid was down, so all three of us slept downstairs, and I completely forgot to set the windows onto their ventilation setting. And I'd done exactly the same thing previously when we'd done a similar stop on the way to or from somewhere. But because this night was absolutely perishing cold. It was a few degrees colder than when we'd done it before, and it was sleeting outside when we stopped. When we actually woke up, the inside of the van was absolutely dripping. Here, for example, is the inside of the cereal cupboard, which was closed all night. But that was particularly interesting as well because it was a great demonstration of this thermal bridging concept. Across the front of the van we have some capped off fixings which presumably secure part of the sleeping roof bed into place. And on that morning there were damp patches around these. So not because we were leaking, because we haven't leaked before or after, it's not a leak that's the issue here. But because those bolts that go through the whole structure were providing this thermal bridge, and so the bolts themselves, with half of them stuck outside in the cold air, were, as you'd expect, conducting heat very well and were causing this thermal bridge. So the whole of the bolt was freezing within an incredibly well insulated frame. And so everything that the bolt touched became cold, and then with the warm wet air it condensed on all the cold patches which had been created around this bolt. Hence this slight patch on the ceiling. Now, as soon as we woke up and realised what was going on, all the windows were open, etc., and we were dry in no time at all. But I thought this was a really interesting demonstration of cold bridging, and why it's quite important to make sure that you've got insulation above or below you, and anything that goes through the entire structure, so you're not creating this pathway for cold air to be transited into. So those are our experiences and our management techniques. What are yours? Do you own a popped up roof bed? Do you have to do anything in the winter, especially in damp UK winters, to try and keep it nicely aired out and mould and mildew free? Pop some comments down below, that would be really helpful. Let's share best practice and see if we can learn from each other. But for now, until the next time, bye for now.